In terms of attacks on journalists, certainly it's more reputation, and it's more sort of verbal harassment. It's more maybe leaking a journalist's phone number.
So welcome to welcome to POC Stories. Today I'm welcoming Nasha, and we're going to talk about women in digital media in Indonesia. So welcome, Nasha, and can you introduce yourself?
So my name's Dr. Nasha Varfen. I am a senior lecturer in journalism at La Trobe University in Melbourne. I was born in Indonesia, however, and a lot of my research looks at the way Indonesian women use the digital media space, particularly as it pertains to combating harmful gender stereotypes and also putting out their voices as women in Indonesia. So in Jakarta itself, I've been a guest professor at a couple of journalism schools, and it's very similar to a lot of journalism schools throughout the world. There's a 50-50 split between men and women. So the female students and the male students, there's about 50-50. When they get into the workplace, it's another story. At the beginning or junior levels of media and newsrooms in Jakarta, again, it's 50-50. But as you go further up the ranks, fewer women are promoted, and that could be because they might leave work to start a family and then come back to work and find that their male colleagues have been promoted or things like that. But certainly in positions of power, there's fewer women. But in the lower ranks of media hierarchy, it's pretty much on parity. It's 50-50, just like in the journalism schools. It's half men, half women. Access to the digital space was really restricted to public spaces. They had these things called warung internet, or warnet for short, and the warnet was it was an internet cafe. And so firstly, you had to be able to afford to go to the internet cafe and buy drinks to be able to stay and use the computers there. But secondly, these were very male sort of dominated spaces. So that took place until that basically silenced or prevented a lot of women from accessing the digital space until people started to use smartphones more widely, and they became a bit cheaper. So lots of people got smartphones, and that meant that more women were able to access the digital space. The issue, however, then changed from discrimination in terms of accessing digital media to the sort of crap that women had to deal with online. So they had to deal with, obviously, the sexism that affects women in everyday life in Indonesia, but also that sexism then sort of moved online. The belief was that women's views were not taken as seriously as men's views politically, went from preventing women to access digital media entirely to, I guess, facing discrimination and facing gender-based attacks whenever they try to speak out about their rights that not just Islam has given them, but also the rights that are given to them according to Indonesian law. And a lot of that, a lot of the Indonesian law, unfortunately, has a lot of catching up to do in terms of giving women their full right. I think there are more women who are working now in Indonesia, and the country certainly many years before a lot of Western countries, it elected its first female president, So women have always been a part of public life, but the issue is that they're confined to certain roles. So, for instance, if you look at something like sport, women are expected to participate as fans. They're expected to support, for instance, the national team, the national football team. But they're not really sort of allowed or expected to play. Like, women playing sport is considered very strange. They're fully expected to participate in being fans. But so that, you see, there's sort of like it's this weird dichotomy. There are some things that women are allowed to do. They're allowed to work, for instance, but they're not expected to rise above, with a few exceptions. Usually the daughters of very powerful families, they're not expected to rise through the ranks in public life. And certainly in terms of safety, personal safety is a big issue in Indonesia, even in the capital city, Jakarta, massive city. But if you go out by yourself, you're putting your life in danger. You literally have to go out with a male relative to ensure your safety.
Enggak, kalau sekarang enggak, kayak iya sih, karena itu mungkin karena ini juga, karena berbahaya juga. Jadi saya juga nggak berani kalau keluar malam-malam sendiri gitu. Pasti minta temenin orang, pasti minta temenin laki-laki yang bisa gitu.
Tapi jika emang Mbak harus pergi ke suatu tempat tersebut dan nggak ada temen, sendirian malam, gimana Mbak? Emang tapi benar-benar harus ke sana?
Biasanya sih pernah sih sendiri keluar, terus ada yang kayak gitu, ada cowok yang kurang ajar gitu, lawan aja. Ya ngapain? Emang ada urusan apa kayak gitu, lawan aja, nggak apa-apa sebenarnya.
Terus juga kan pasti kan tingkat keselamatan di kota-kota lain kan selalu pasti berbeda kan dari Indonesia. Terus gimana Mbak membandingkan tingkat keselamatan yang dinikmati perempuan Jakarta dengan perempuan yang di luar Jakarta atau di daerah lain?
Beda banget ya. Kalau Jakarta kan ibu kota, pergaulan bebas lebih banyak, lebih tinggi.
So being a woman in a public space and being a woman in the digital public space certainly comes with a whole heap of challenges. Things like access to decent prayer facilities at mosques. There are some mosques which are fantastic. They give lots of space to women, but conversely there are a lot of mosques where actually going there, even making wudu, making ablution, puts you in danger. Now, the work that I do in terms of my research basically interviews women journalists who write about this sort of thing, and then they cop a lot of criticism. All right, so they cop a lot of criticism when they interview female activists, right? People who are marching for instance, better access to mosques, the right to go to the supermarket or go to the local grocery store without being catcalled, without being sexually harassed on the street. When they write about these issues, they're attacked. Right, so that's why they turn to digital media, because many of the people that I have interviewed as part of my research, they were actually journalists. So they used to be journalists with the Jakarta Post, the Jakarta Times, all the Indonesian language newspapers. And when they wrote about these sorts of things, they were just criticized by the male readers, So a lot of them have since left and become independent journalists. So they've set up their own online spaces where they can write about this sort of thing without being attacked by their male readers, or in some instances, even their male colleagues, would say, why do you have to write about this? Why do you have to talk about this? This puts Indonesia in a bad light, right? It makes us look very bad. And so through these online spaces, they do things like organize International Women's Day marches, and they lobby to do that through social media. So they'll use Instagram, or they'll use Twitter, or they'll use Facebook to arrange these marches. Now, if they were still working as journalists with the mainstream media organizations, I don't think they'd be given as much freedom to write about these issues and to try and organize support for things like organizing International Women's Day marches in Jakarta, all of that sort of thing. That's why I think the digital space for them has been a huge benefit, because it allows them to set up their own media voices, to publish the voices of not just fellow Indonesian women, writers and activists and journalists, but also people who might be criticized by certain segments of Indonesian society. It can be quite a conservative Muslim society. So if we're talking about things like gender rights, that sort of thing, these sorts of online spaces offer a chance for these voices to be heard as well. If they were to work on mainstream media, a lot of them were actually saying that often, for instance, editors would push them to do stories about fashion, about beauty, about, clothes, about makeup, that sort of thing, balancing, the work-life balance, all of these sort of soft topics. And a lot of the women that I spoke to, they wanted to talk about politics. They wanted to talk about women's rights. They wanted to talk about, how difficult it was for women to succeed in business, in politics. They wanted to talk about the glass ceiling. They wanted to talk about the sexual harassment that Indonesian women often face. And they wanted to talk about how it can be a very superficial society. So you're judged on how wealthy you are, how you look, how skinny you are, all of those sorts of things. But it's not that they weren't allowed to write about these sorts of things. When they were given the chance to write about it, then there would be a lot of pushback. There'd be a lot of criticism if they did write about it. So, I guess it's not as simple as saying they were not allowed to write about these serious topics. They were allowed to write about it, but invariably they'd get harassed, they'd get doxxed, their phone numbers would be published, all sorts of things. And the sort of the criticism and the harassment moved from the digital space into their personal lives. So so that was something that a lot of them found incredibly frightening. To have their personal safety, under threat. The gendered attacks against female journalists are very, very subtle. So there's not so much, sort of the threat of physical safety, although Jakarta as a whole is not a safe place for women if they're traveling by themselves. But in terms of attacks on journalists, certainly it's more reputation, and it's more sort of verbal harassment. It's more maybe leaking a journalist's phone number so that she might get a lot of Indonesian newsrooms work using WhatsApp and similar messaging services. So a female journalist's number, if she's written something that's upset people, for instance, if she's written about access to the local mosque, for instance, and then people who are in the area might get upset about that, try and find out what's her phone number, and then leak that, and then she'll get a lot of harassing or threatening messages from people that she doesn't know on WhatsApp. And of course, working in that field, they can't keep their number private, so they have to keep their number. They just basically have to keep blocking people, and the police force is useless for this sort of thing. So the police are not going to help them with this. And it takes as you can imagine, this sort of thing takes an emotional toll. It takes it means the women pay quite a huge mental price. And then that's why, certainly in the case of 3 or 4, at least 4 of the women that I've spoken to, they've sort of left their jobs as journalists, and instead veered more, I guess, into activism. And they use their journalistic training to help them in their work as activists, and they've set up their own sort of spaces online where they can write about these things. Sometimes they get attention from people in the highest positions of power. Because of the pandemic, this didn't happen in 2020, but in 2019, they organised massive marches on International Women's Day, and that caught the attention of the Indonesian president. And the Indonesian president actually tweeted about it, and he said, we need to look into these issues. We know that the situation for women is not ideal in Jakarta, in political life, in religious life, and in business. We know that women are discriminated against, and we need to do something. So it was nice for them to get that validation from the president, but they're just words, so the system is pretty much very, very entrenched against women, and it's going to take a very, very long time for those sorts of attitudes to change. So one of the female journalists or ex-journalists that I spoke to, who now identifies as an activist instead, and she runs a digital magazine which looks at gender issues, and she said to me that once she raised the topic of just being able to access mosques, to her local community, people that she knew, male friends, relatives, and they hit back with, why are you such a Western feminist? So it's that sort of mentality. She wasn't talking about the rights given to her by Western feminism. She was talking about the rights given to her by Islam, but this is the sort of mentality that she was up against. And so that sort of thing, unfortunately, takes a very long. It's generational change. So while they've been successful in using, for instance, social media to organise these marches outside of the digital space, through the streets of Jakarta, so they've been able to use digital media to support their offline activism. And while it's gotten some attention, it unfortunately, in terms of meaningful change, the attention hasn't really been, it hasn't been realistic in terms of implementing change. That unfortunately is, it's a cultural shift, and that's going to take a very long time.